They thought she was just another tired nurse grabbing breakfast. Blue scrubs, dark circles under her eyes, a well-trained German shepherd by her side. But what these two bullies didn't know, before she ever wore those scrubs, she wore a different uniform. She was a Marine. And when they cornered that terrified waitress, demanding money with threats and intimidation, they were about to learn what happens when you threaten the innocent in front of someone trained to protect. This is the story of the breakfast that changed everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The coffee was still hot in her hand when she heard it. Not the words at first, the tone. That low, sharp edge of male aggression that cuts through background noise and lands somewhere deep in the nervous system. Every woman knows it. It's not loud yet. It doesn't need to be. It carries promise, threat, ownership. She stood near the counter, blue scrubs rumpled from a long night, eyes heavy, body aching in that familiar, bone-deep way that comes after 12 hours of holding other people together. Breakfast was supposed to be simple. Eggs, toast, silence. A moment before the world asked her for something again. Then the voice came again, closer now. Younger, unsteady. Please, the waitress said. Her words caught, frayed at the edges. I told you I don't have it today. The sentence never finished. It didn't need to. The pause that followed was worse. A silence thick enough to mean consequences. The nurse didn't turn right away. She didn't rush. She didn't react the way movies teach people to react. Instead, something older and quieter woke up inside her. A shift, a recalibration. The exhaustion was still there, pressing down on her shoulders, tugging at her spine. But beneath it, trained instincts stirred, steady and patient. She took a slow breath. In through her nose, out through her mouth. Across the diner, two men stood too close to the young waitress. Too close for a conversation. Too close for anything innocent. One of them leaned forward, invading her space, his body angled just enough to block her path. The other stood half a step back, watching the room, watching her, watching who might be watching them. No one was. A few customers stared into their plates. Someone pretended to scroll on their phone. A fork scraped against ceramic, loud in the quiet. The air held its breath. The waitress's hands shook as she clutched the small order pad against her chest like it could protect her. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen, then back again. There would be no rescue from there. She already knew that. The nurse noticed everything. The way the waitress's shoulders curled inward. The way her weight shifted, preparing to retreat. The way one of the men smiled. Not wide, not obvious, but tight. Satisfied. A smile that said this wasn't new. That this had worked before. Her grip tightened around the coffee cup. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she'd just come off a brutal shift. She told herself she wasn't in uniform anymore. That she wasn't responsible. That someone else would step in. Someone always should. No one did. A memory flickered at the edge of her mind. Sand. Heat. A different kind of silence, broken by distant noise and closer fear. She pushed it away before it could fully form. She'd made a promise to herself years ago, back in Fallujah. A promise about exactly this kind of moment. She did not think about the promise now. She couldn't afford to. Thinking made things complicated. Thinking invited doubt. What she did instead was what she'd been trained to do long before scrubs and stethoscopes. She assessed. Distance. Exits. Hands. Body language. Intent. The man closest to the waitress reached out. Not hard. Not yet. Just enough to let his fingers brush her wrist as she tried to step back. That was the moment. Something settled inside the nurse's chest, heavy and calm, like a door closing. The calculation ended. Exhaustion lost the argument. She set the coffee down carefully. Not rushed. Not dramatic. The ceramic touched the counter without a sound. The German shepherd at her side, silent until now, shifted his weight. His ears flattened slightly. He felt it too. The waitress's voice broke. Please, she said again, softer this time. Smaller. I'm just trying to work. The nurse stood. The movement was simple, almost unremarkable, but it changed the room. Chairs creaked. Someone looked up. The men glanced over, registering her presence for the first time, and dismissing it just as quickly. They saw a tired woman. Dark circles. Wrinkled scrubs. Someone who would mind her own business. They were wrong. She took one step forward, then another, placing herself not aggressively, not dramatically, but deliberately into the space where silence had been winning. Her heart beat once. Steady. Controlled. This was the point of no return. The moment between recognition and action. The choice everyone thinks they'll make correctly, until they have to make it. She chose. And if you believe staying silent makes you complicit, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next proves that standing up changes everything. But to understand what happened next, you need to know who Sarah Mitchell really was. To the people in that diner, she looked like countless others who passed through places like that every morning. Quiet, tired, anonymous. Blue scrubs, sensible shoes. The kind of woman you don't notice because she isn't trying to be noticed. But that surface told only the smallest fraction of her story. Before the scrubs, there had been a different uniform. Sarah Mitchell had been a Marine. She enlisted young, driven less by patriotism than by purpose. She wanted structure, clarity, a way to be useful in a world that often felt chaotic. The Marines gave her all of that, and then took something back in return. She served overseas, in places where days blurred together in dust and heat, where decisions had consequences measured in lives, not regrets. She learned discipline there, precision. She learned how to stay calm when everything around her screamed panic. And she learned what it felt like to fail. There are moments in combat that never leave you, no matter how much time passes or how far you travel from them. One of those moments followed Sarah home. It lived quietly in the back of her mind, surfacing in dreams she didn't talk about and silences she couldn't explain. It was in Fallujah that she made a promise to herself, born from a moment she could never forget. A moment where hesitation cost something precious. A moment that rewired the way she understood responsibility forever. When her service ended, Sarah didn't come home triumphant. She came home searching. She tried civilian life the way so many veterans do, awkwardly, carefully, with the sense that the world had moved on without her. Crowded places made her tense. Sudden noises set her nerves on edge. Sleep came in fragments. The war had ended, but her body hadn't gotten the message. She could have chosen many paths. Security, private contracting, work that leaned into what she already knew. Instead, she surprised everyone, including herself, by choosing nursing. Healing, she decided, was another form of service. She enrolled in school, older than many of her classmates, quieter than most. Where others flinched at blood or pressure, Sarah focused. She understood trauma. She understood pain. More importantly, she understood how much it mattered to have someone steady in the room when everything else was falling apart. Nursing wasn't a rejection of her past. It was an evolution of it. County General became her second home. She worked nights, long, relentless shifts that demanded everything she had and then asked for more. 12-hour marathons of saving lives, stabilizing the broken, holding hands through final breaths. She saw humanity at its rawest there. Fear, gratitude, loss, survival. She carried all of it quietly, never making herself the center of any story. And through it all, she was never alone. Atlas entered her life during her recovery, a German shepherd trained not just to obey commands, but to understand her. He was more than a service dog. He was an anchor. When her breathing quickened, he grounded her. When her thoughts spiraled, he brought her back. He slept near the door, alert but calm, a silent partner who shared the weight she never spoke aloud. Together, they rebuilt a routine. Night shifts, early mornings, coffee stops after work when the city was just waking up. The same diner, the same booth, familiar faces that never asked questions. Sarah liked it that way. She wasn't hiding. She just wasn't advertising who she'd been. Most people at County General knew her as reliable, competent, the nurse you wanted nearby when things went wrong. They didn't know about Fallujah. They didn't know about the promise. They didn't know about the version of Sarah who had once been trained to move toward danger instead of away from it. And that was intentional. The last time she'd used her combat training on American soil was 3 years ago. The circumstances were different, but the aftermath was the same. Paperwork, questions, sleepless nights. She'd looked at herself afterward and sworn it would be the last time. She wanted a quieter life, a safer one. She wanted to believe that healing meant leaving that part of herself behind. But some promises are made to be broken. Sarah didn't wake up that morning expecting anything unusual. She was exhausted, running on habit and caffeine. Just another shift survived. Just another sunrise earned. She sat in that diner not as a Marine, not as a hero, but as a woman trying to catch her breath before the world needed her again. She didn't know yet that the promise she made in Fallujah was about to come due. And if you believe heroes don't always wear capes, sometimes they wear scrubs, comment, I stand for justice. Her name was Emma Chun, and she was 22 years old. If you'd walked into that diner on any ordinary morning, you might have noticed her smile first, not because it was bright, but because it worked so hard. The kind of smile someone wears like armor. Polite, professional, careful not to invite questions. Emma moved quickly between tables, refilling coffee, memorizing orders, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She had learned early that speed and kindness were her best defenses. This job wasn't temporary for her. It wasn't a stepping stone or a side hustle. It was her lifeline. Emma grew up in a single-parent household. Her father had been gone for years, leaving her mother to raise 2 children on her own. Emma became an adult faster than she should have, helping with homework, cooking meals, translating paperwork her mother struggled to understand. Her younger brother was still in high school, smart and hopeful in a way Emma both admired and worried about. She wanted him to have choices. She wanted him to dream without calculating the cost. Then her mother got sick. The diagnosis came quietly, delivered in a sterile room with words that sounded manageable until the bills arrived. Treatment was expensive. Insurance covered some things, but not enough. There were medications that had to be paid for out of pocket. Medications her mother needed to stay functional, to stay alive. So Emma picked up more shifts. She worked mornings, nights, weekends. She slept when she could. She studied invoices the way other people studied textbooks. Every dollar had a destination before it ever reached her hands. Rent, utilities, groceries, her brother's school supplies. And every single week, one number sat at the center of it all. $200. That was when the men first approached her. At first, they were almost polite. They ordered coffee. They tipped just enough to seem harmless. One day, one of them mentioned how busy the diner was, how exposed, how things could happen in neighborhoods like this. The next week, the message became clearer. They were looking out for the place, for her, and all they needed in return was a small weekly payment. Protection, they called it. Emma laughed nervously the first time, thinking it had to be a joke. But the laughter didn't come back the second time, or the third. The protection racket settled into her life like a parasite. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. $200 a week was exactly what her mother's medication cost. Not approximately. Not most of it. Exactly. Every single week. Emma did the math over and over again, hoping it would change. It never did. She had a choice to make, and it wasn't a fair one. Her mother's health, or her own safety. She tried to say no, carefully, politely. She tried to explain that she didn't have extra money, that tips fluctuated, that she was barely scraping by. The response was always the same. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Comments about her brother walking home from school. About knowing her schedule. About how unfortunate it would be if something happened to the diner. Emma went to her manager. The first time, he waved her off. Told her not to exaggerate. The second time, he told her not to cause trouble. The third time, he reminded her how many people wanted her job. His message was clear even if his words weren't. This was her problem. When the threats escalated, Emma stopped asking for help. She started paying. Each week, she peeled the bills from her envelope with shaking hands, feeling like she was feeding something that would only grow hungrier. She hated herself for complying, hated the fear that lived in her chest, hated the way the men looked at her like they owned a piece of her life. But she showed up anyway. Every shift, every day, because her family depended on her. What Emma didn't know was that she wasn't alone, not really. She didn't know that these same men had been doing this to others all over the neighborhood. To delivery drivers, to gas station attendants, to other waitresses who learned, just like she did, that resistance came with consequences. 17 people, at least, had been paying in silence. And they'd never been stopped. Not once. So that morning, when Emma said, "Please, I don't have it today," it wasn't defiance. It was desperation. A calculation gone wrong. A week where the numbers didn't add up, where the envelope came up short, where her mother's medication had already claimed its share. She wasn't trying to be brave. She was trying to survive. And if you can't stand people who prey on the vulnerable, comment, "No more bullies." Let's make this the most engaged with justice story on YouTube. Their names were Marcus and Tony Delgado. Brothers by blood, partners by habit, predators by choice. They weren't the kind of criminals people imagine when they think of danger. No dramatic heists. No headlines. No sudden bursts of chaos. Their operation was quieter than that. Methodical, repetitive, designed to stay invisible. They lived in the cracks of the neighborhood, feeding on people who couldn't afford attention, let alone protection. They had learned early that fear was more reliable than force. Marcus was the older one, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that came from believing the world owed him something. He talked more, smiled more. He liked to be seen as the brains, the negotiator, the one who handled people. Tony, younger and leaner, stayed half a step back. Less charm, more volatility. Where Marcus enjoyed control, Tony enjoyed intimidation. Together, they were efficient. Their method was simple. They targeted service workers, the people who couldn't walk away. Waitresses who depended on tips. Delivery drivers with predictable routes. Gas station attendants working alone overnight. People whose livelihoods required them to stay polite, stay present, stay vulnerable. Marcus would frame it as help. Tony made sure the help felt mandatory. And it worked. They never asked for too much at once. Just enough to hurt. Just enough to keep their victims desperate. Enough to ensure silence. Complaints rarely went anywhere. Reports, when they happened at all, were vague, fearful, easy to dismiss. Victims learned quickly that speaking up only made things worse. That was why the Delgado brothers had never been caught. Intimidation did the work for them. In their minds, this wasn't crime. It was entitlement. A system they believed favored the bold. They told themselves these people were weak. That they were lucky anyone bothered to protect them at all. Marcus liked to say it out loud, usually with a laugh. Tony didn't bother saying it. He showed it. Over time, success bred comfort. Comfort became arrogance. They stopped watching exits. Stopped worrying about witnesses. They believed they could read a room instantly, and that no one in it would ever challenge them. They mistook politeness for submission, fear for permission. They had forgotten something important. Predators sometimes meet apex predators. On this particular morning, the brothers were already on edge. Tony hadn't slept. His gambling debts had spiraled faster than he'd admitted, and patience wasn't something he'd ever had much of. He needed cash, and he needed it now. Marcus was under pressure of his own. A court date loomed. Another minor charge, another brush with consequences he fully expected to avoid. Money meant leverage. Money meant options. So they pushed harder. When they walked into the diner, they weren't looking for breakfast. They were looking for compliance. Marcus scanned the room out of habit, clocking who mattered and who didn't. Tony's attention locked onto the counter. Onto Emma. He could already sense hesitation in her movements. That hesitation annoyed him. They closed in the way they always did. Slow, deliberate, confident no one would interfere. Marcus leaned in close, lowering his voice just enough to feel private. Tony positioned himself to block escape, his presence doing most of the talking. They expected the usual rhythm. Fear. Apology. Payment. When Emma said she didn't have it, something snapped. Marcus felt it as an insult. Tony felt it as resistance. Both of them felt entitled to more than they were being given. And entitlement, when challenged, turns ugly fast. They escalated because escalation had always worked. What they didn't account for was the woman at the counter. When Marcus finally glanced her way, he dismissed her instantly. Blue scrubs, slumped shoulders, a tired face that looked like it belonged to someone counting minutes until sleep. Just another customer. Just another bystander who would mind her own business. That assumption would become the most expensive mistake of his life. Because what they saw was exhaustion. What they should have seen was discipline. What they should have seen was someone who didn't measure strength by volume or threat displays. Someone who understood violence not as chaos, but as consequence. Someone who had faced men far more dangerous than they would ever be, and survived. They didn't see a warning. They saw permission. And if you're not siding with bullies who exploit hardworking people, hit that like button. Show them that viewers stand with the vulnerable, not the predators. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, until it finally broke. Marcus reached out and grabbed Emma's wrist. It wasn't violent at first. Not a yank. Not a strike. Just fingers closing around skin with deliberate pressure, enough to stop her from stepping away, enough to remind her who he believed was in control. Emma froze. Her breath caught sharply in her chest, eyes wide as instinct screamed at her to pull back, while fear told her not to make it worse. Around them, the diner went very quiet. A man at the counter stared hard into his coffee like it held the secrets of the universe. A couple in a booth suddenly found their phone fascinating. Someone shifted in their seat, uncomfortable, but didn't stand. The air filled with that familiar, suffocating phenomenon, everyone waiting for someone else to act. Tony moved smoothly, cutting off Emma's path toward the kitchen. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His body alone was enough, a wall made of intent and threat. He smiled at her then, slow and humorless, the way people do when they know they've cornered someone. The manager was nowhere to be seen. Later, people would say he must have been in the back, checking inventory, making a call, anything but watching, anything but choosing. Emma's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled over before she could stop them, her voice collapsing into something raw and unguarded. "Please," she said, the word barely louder than a whisper. "Please. My mom needs her medication. I don't have it today." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't strategy. It was truth. Marcus sighed as if inconvenienced, tightening his grip just enough to hurt. Tony leaned in slightly, enjoying the moment. To them, this was leverage. Proof that they were winning. Across the room, Sarah watched everything. From her position, she could see the angle of Marcus's arm, the way Emma's wrist was twisted just past comfortable. She noted Tony's stance, his feet planted, his shoulders squared to block escape. She saw the empty doorway to the back and understood what it meant without needing confirmation. She registered the bystanders, the way fear had paralyzed them into silence. And then, without warning, the world narrowed. The sounds of the diner dulled, receding into the background. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse steadied. A switch flipped, not emotionally, but mechanically. Training took over, the way it always had when moments mattered. Distance. 2 men. 1 victim. 1 exit blocked. 1 clear aggressor, 1 secondary threat. Atlas felt it before Sarah moved. The German shepherd shifted at her side, ears flattening, muscles coiling with restrained readiness. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply knew. Years of training and partnership had taught him to recognize the change in her before action followed. Sarah's exhaustion vanished, replaced by clarity. She remembered Fallujah, not the images, not the noise, but the lesson. The promise she'd carved into herself after that day. Never let fear win when you have the power to act. Never outsource responsibility to hope. Never wait for someone else to do what you know is right. Still, she didn't move yet. What Sarah did next wasn't impulsive. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. In the Marines, she'd learned that action without control was recklessness. That strength without restraint created more damage than it prevented. Rules of engagement existed for a reason. You de-escalated first. You offered a way out. You made your presence known. She counted silently. 1 chance. She watched Marcus's face, looking for hesitation. She watched Tony's hands, his balance, his breathing. She measured how fast she could close the distance if she had to, and how to do it without anyone else getting hurt. Emma sobbed quietly now, shoulders shaking, humiliated and terrified in equal measure. 2 chances. Sarah shifted her weight slightly, just enough to feel her footing. Atlas adjusted with her, seamless and silent. The room felt charged, like a storm building pressure before it breaks. Every second stretched longer than the last, each one daring someone to intervene. 3 chances. Sarah knew this was the line. After this, there would be no pretending it wasn't happening. No retreat into anonymity. No more coffee. No more quiet breakfast. She was about to offer them a choice. And once that choice was offered, everything would change. Sarah stood up. There was nothing sudden about it. No scrape of the chair. No sharp movement meant to draw attention. She rose the way she did everything else, with intention. Calm. Balanced. Her shoulders squared naturally, her posture aligning not in challenge, but in readiness. The exhaustion that had weighed her down minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. Control. Atlas stood with her. The German shepherd didn't bark or strain at his leash. He simply moved into position at her side, head level, body steady, eyes alert. It was a trained response, practiced countless times in silence. To anyone watching closely, it was obvious this was not a pet reacting emotionally. This was a partner responding to a cue. Sarah took 1 step forward, then another. She stopped at a distance that was neither aggressive nor passive, close enough to be unmistakably involved, far enough to leave no doubt she was choosing restraint. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the diner with startling clarity. "Excuse me," she said evenly. "I think the lady asked you to leave her alone." The words were simple, polite even, but the tone carried weight. Not anger, not fear. Authority. Marcus turned slowly, irritation flashing across his face as his eyes landed on Sarah. He took her in a single, dismissive glance. The scrubs. The tired face. The dog. Tony followed his gaze, smirking. "Mind your business, lady," Marcus said, his grip still tight on Emma's wrist. "This doesn't concern you." For a brief moment, the room held its breath. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't posture. "I'm making it my business," she said calmly. "Step away from her." Now, there was no threat in her words. No insult. No escalation. Just a clear, unmistakable directive. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the diner seemed to fall away. No clinking dishes. No murmurs. Just the sound of breathing. Emma's uneven and panicked. Marcus's slow and incredulous. Tony's shallow and sharp. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. Then he laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't joyful. It was the laugh of someone who had never been challenged by someone like this before. A laugh born of disbelief and ego colliding. That was his second mistake. Tony didn't laugh. Tony watched. His eyes dropped briefly, not to Sarah's face, but to her stance. Her balance. The dog at her side. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but real. A flicker of calculation replaced the smug confidence he'd worn moments earlier. His hand moved toward his pocket. Sarah saw it. Atlas saw it. Time compressed. For seconds. That was all it would take. For seconds that would later be paused, replayed, slowed down frame by investigators reviewing the diner's security footage. For seconds that would determine whether this ended with bruises or with bodies on the floor. Sarah didn't react yet. She held her ground, eyes steady, voice still calm. This was the final chance. The last off-ramp before consequences. Around them, fear surged. Emma stopped crying, her breath hitching as hope and terror tangled in her chest. Some customers finally realized what was happening and felt the cold weight of it settle in. This was no longer uncomfortable. This was dangerous. Sarah was aware of all of it, but ruled by none of it. Her heart rate stayed low. Her hands relaxed at her sides. Her focus narrowed to the essentials. Tony's pocket. Marcus's grip. Atlas's posture. Relief rippled briefly through the room simply because someone had spoken up. Because silence had been broken. Pride followed just as quickly. The instinctive recognition that courage was standing where cowardice had been moments before. And then came fear. Not for Emma. For Sarah. Because standing up draws attention. And attention, in moments like this, carries risk. If you've ever wished you had the courage to stand up like this, share this video. Because courage is contagious, and this story proves it. Tony's hand came out of his pocket with intent. Steel flashed briefly under the diner's lights. Not waved, not slashed, just revealed. A knife held low and close to the body, the way someone holds it when they've done this before. The escalation was instant and irreversible. Sarah didn't think. Her training took over the way breathing does, automatic, precise, unforgiving of hesitation. The world slowed, not because time changed, but because her perception sharpened. Every detail stretched into clarity. Tony shifted his weight forward. That was the tell. Sarah moved. She closed the distance in a single step, her body angling slightly offline so the blade had nothing clean to target. Her hand met his wrist not with force, but with timing, redirecting the motion instead of resisting it. The knife never had a chance to come up. Momentum became liability as she turned his own movement against him. Control came next. She anchored his arm, rotated her hips, and took his center of gravity away before his brain could catch up with what was happening. Tony stumbled, shock widening his eyes as balance vanished beneath him. He went down hard, the knife clattering away across the floor, suddenly irrelevant. Gasps rippled through the diner. Marcus lunged. He moved on instinct, anger and disbelief driving him forward, one hand reaching towards Sarah, the other already forming a fist. He was faster than Tony, but sloppier. He committed fully, expecting brute force to solve the problem. It didn't. Sarah pivoted, letting his momentum carry him past where she had been. Her movement was economical, almost casual, as she hooked his arm and redirected his forward drive downward. The second takedown was different, less explosive, more surgical. Marcus hit the floor with a heavy thud, the sound of breath leaving lungs all at once. It was over almost as soon as it began. Under 30 seconds from escalation to control, the diner stood frozen. Atlas never attacked. The German shepherd moved exactly as trained, stepping forward, placing his body between Sarah and the fallen men, a silent wall of muscle and intent. His posture alone communicated everything necessary. He was not there to bite. He was there to end the fight. Sarah remained standing. Her breathing was steady, her expression unchanged. She scanned once, quickly, confirming no additional threats, then shifted her attention back to the men on the ground. One controlled with pressure and leverage. The other stunned, disoriented, contained by positioning rather than pain. Only then did time snap back into place. The sounds returned all at once. Chairs scraping, someone shouting, a plate shattering as it slipped from numb fingers. Emma stood rooted to the spot, hands over her mouth, eyes wide with something that wasn't fear anymore. Later, customers would struggle to describe what they'd seen. They'd say it happened too fast, that it didn't feel violent, that there was no rage, no chaos. One would search for the right word and finally land on it. Elegant. But here's what nobody in that diner knew. Sarah wasn't supposed to be there that morning. Her shift at County General had ended hours late because of an emergency surgery that ran long. A complication. A life hanging in the balance. If she'd clocked out on time, she would have gone straight home. No breakfast. No coffee. No diner. Emma would have been alone. The thought would come later, uninvited and unsettling. The realization that timing, random, ordinary timing, had placed her exactly where she needed to be. That a delay meant for one life had protected another. For now, Sarah stayed focused. She spoke calmly, directing a nearby customer to call the police. She checked Emma with a quick glance, reassuring without words. Atlas held his position, eyes never leaving the men, discipline unwavering. The predators lay still. The room exhaled. Satisfaction followed awe, not the loud kind, but the deep, steady kind that comes when something wrong has been stopped cleanly, when power has shifted back where it belongs. And beneath that satisfaction, something quieter stirred. Wonder. If you believe this is what standing up looks like, comment justice served. Let's flood the comments with support for real heroes. For a moment, no one moved. Then Emma did. Her hands were still shaking as she fumbled for her phone, fingers clumsy with adrenaline and disbelief. It took her 2 tries to unlock the screen. When she finally managed it, her voice trembled as she spoke to the operator, words spilling out in a rush. Address, knives, men on the ground, please hurry. She kept glancing up as if afraid this fragile sense of safety might disappear if she looked away for too long. Sarah stayed exactly where she was. She didn't kneel on the men. She didn't strike them again. She applied control the way she'd been trained to: pressure points, leverage, positioning. Enough to keep them immobilized. Not enough to cause unnecessary harm. Her grip was firm but measured, professional restraint rather than punishment. Atlas remained planted at her side, a silent barrier that made further resistance unthinkable. Slowly, the rest of the diner came back to life. A man near the window began filming, hands still unsteady. Another customer moved closer, offering Emma a napkin, then a chair. Someone else locked the front door, more instinct than instruction. The shock was giving way to something else now, a collective realization that something extraordinary had just happened in front of them. And then, finally, the manager appeared. He emerged from the back hallway, eyes wide, face pale, trying to look confused instead of complicit. He asked what was going on, his voice thin and unnecessary. No one answered him. The silence he was met with said everything that needed to be said. Marcus stirred on the floor, rage replacing confusion as awareness returned. You have no idea who you're messing with, he snapped, struggling against Sarah's control. You just ruined your life. Sarah didn't look down at him. She didn't need to. I know exactly who I'm messing with, she said evenly. I've faced actual enemies. You're just bullies. The words landed hard. They weren't shouted. They weren't meant to humiliate. They were factual, and somehow, that made them worse. Sirens grew louder in the distance, cutting through the tension like a promise. 8 minutes from the call to arrival. 8 minutes that felt both endless and fleeting. Sarah held her position without wavering. Atlas remained still. The brothers stopped struggling, reality setting in alongside the cold floor beneath them. When the police arrived, the shift in power became official. Officers moved in quickly, securing the scene, separating the men, collecting the knife. Questions began to fly, but Sarah answered only what was necessary. Calm, clear, composed. Her demeanor alone set the tone for what this was, and what it wasn't. Emma stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming freely now that she no longer had to be strong. When it was finally over, when the officers had taken over, she stepped forward hesitantly. She looked at Sarah like she was trying to memorize her. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice breaking completely. "You saved me." Sarah softened then, just a little. She reached out, steadying Emma the way she'd steadied so many patients before. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "That matters." But the story wasn't over. As officers ran Marcus and Tony's names, expressions began to change. Radios crackled. One officer glanced at another, eyebrows lifting. A pause stretched. Something heavy settled into the air again. This time not fear, but revelation. This wasn't their first arrest. It wasn't even their 20th. The charges stacked up quickly. Prior complaints. Open investigations. A trail of intimidation that reached far beyond this diner. What had looked like a single incident was suddenly something much larger and far uglier. And it would be their last. A detective stepped through the door then, scanning the scene with practiced eyes. When he saw Sarah, he stopped short. Recognition flashed across his face. "Sarah," he said, disbelief and respect tangled in his voice. They'd served together. What he was about to tell her would reveal just how many lives she'd saved that morning. Far more than she realized in that moment. If you believe people should be held accountable for their actions, hit subscribe. Because trolls and bullies hate when their stories get exposed, but justice demands it. Detective James Rivera didn't start with questions. He started with a look. One that held recognition, disbelief, and something close to gratitude. The years had changed them both, but not enough to erase the bond forged under pressure. They stepped aside from the noise, from the murmurs and flashing lights, into a pocket of quiet where truth could settle. Rivera spoke softly, deliberately, the way he always had when things mattered. The Delgado brothers weren't unknown to him. For 6 months, his unit had been circling them without being able to close the trap. Reports kept surfacing, whispers, half-statements, anonymous tips that never quite crossed the line into testimony. Service workers, small businesses. The same pattern every time. Money demanded, fear enforced, silence ensured. 17 confirmed victims. 17 people who had been squeezed just hard enough to comply, just scared enough to disappear back into their routines. No witnesses willing to sign statements. No one willing to sit in a courtroom and point. Intimidation had done its job perfectly. Emma would have been the 18th. Rivera laid it all out for Sarah, not with dramatics, but with the blunt weight of fact. He told her how close they'd been to losing the case entirely. How prosecutors had warned that without a clean arrest and solid testimony, the brothers would walk again. How many nights he'd gone home angry, knowing exactly who was hurting people but unable to prove it. Then he looked at her. "And then you showed up," he said quietly. The investigation didn't unfold all at once. It clicked together, piece by piece, like a puzzle finally given its missing center. Emma's testimony mattered. Not just because she spoke, but because she spoke with clarity and courage, no longer alone. Sarah's witness account anchored it, precise and credible. The security footage removed any remaining doubt. For the first time, prosecutors had everything they needed. And something unexpected happened. The silence broke. One by one, other victims came forward. A delivery driver who'd paid for months and hated himself for it. A gas station attendant who'd stopped sleeping through the night. Another waitress who'd memorized escape routes instead of menus. Each testimony made the next one easier. Fear lost its grip when people realized they weren't isolated, that someone had finally stood up, and it had worked. 17 voices found their way back. Sarah watched it unfold from the margins, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to deny the impact. She hadn't planned to be a catalyst. She hadn't acted for recognition or justice in the abstract. She'd acted because in that moment, doing nothing was no longer an option. Still, the weight of it settled in slowly. 30 seconds. That was all it had taken. 30 seconds of movement instead of silence. 30 seconds of courage instead of comfort. And 17 people got their lives back. Rivera handed her a file then, not for procedure, but for perspective. Inside were names, statements, timelines. Human lives reduced to paper, waiting for someone to take them seriously. Sarah felt something shift deep in her chest as she turned the pages. Memories surfaced uninvited. Fallujah, a narrow street, a local translator who trusted them, a moment of hesitation, a consequence she'd carried for 8 years without ever speaking aloud. That was where the promise had been made, not from pride, but from guilt, from the knowledge that inaction could wound just as deeply as violence. She had worn that failure like a second uniform, until now. Standing there, in the aftermath of a diner breakfast gone anything but ordinary, Sarah understood something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. Redemption didn't come from erasing the past. It came from answering the present. This morning, she had. She felt pride, not the loud kind, not the self-congratulatory kind, but the quiet certainty that she had finally kept the promise she once thought she'd broken forever. The guilt loosened its grip. Forgiveness, earned, not given, took its place. One person had mattered. And if this story proves that one person can make a difference, comment, one person matters. Let's remind everyone watching that they have power too. Over the weeks that followed that morning in the diner, Emma Chin's life began to change in ways she never thought possible. At first, the change was quiet, subtle. It showed up in how she slept through the night for the first time in months, how her shoulders no longer tightened every time the diner door chimed. The fear that had lived in her body for so long didn't disappear overnight, but it loosened its grip. When the prosecutor asked if she was willing to testify, Emma surprised herself by saying yes without hesitation. Just weeks earlier, the idea of sitting in a courtroom, of speaking the names Marcus and Tony Delgado out loud, would have sent her into a panic. But something had shifted. That morning in the diner had rewritten the story she told herself about who she was. She wasn't just a scared waitress anymore. She was a witness, a survivor, someone who had stood her ground and lived to tell the truth. On the day of her testimony, Emma walked into the courthouse with her head held high. Her hands still trembled, but her voice didn't. She told the judge about the threats, the weekly payments, the way her stomach dropped every time she saw those men walk through the door. She spoke about the impossible choice she'd been forced to make between her mother's medication and her own safety. And when she finished, she didn't cry. She breathed. Word spread quickly after that, first through the neighborhood, then across the city. People who had never met Emma, who had never set foot in that diner, felt compelled to do something. A former customer started a GoFundMe to help with her mother's medical bills. At first, Emma resisted. She wasn't used to asking for help, but Sarah gently reminded her that accepting support wasn't weakness, it was community. Within hours, donations poured in. $5, $10. Notes from strangers saying, "You're brave. We believe you. You're not alone." By the end of the first day, the fundraiser had reached $12,000. By the second, $31,000. On the third day, it passed $47,000. Emma sat at her kitchen table, staring at the screen, tears streaming down her face as her mother squeezed her hand. For the first time since her diagnosis, there was no question about whether they could afford treatment. Appointments were scheduled. Prescriptions were filled. The weight that had pressed on Emma's chest for years finally lifted. Her mother's health began to improve almost immediately. Color returned to her face. Strength came back to her voice. And every morning, she reminded Emma of something she would never forget. "You saved me," she said. But Emma knew the truth. She hadn't done it alone. As the weeks went on, Emma made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She quit the diner, not out of bitterness, but because she realized she no longer belonged there. That chapter of her life had closed. She had been surviving. Now she wanted to do more than that. She enrolled in nursing school. When people asked her why, her answer was always the same. "Because a nurse saved my life," she said. "And now I want to give that to someone else." The first time Emma walked into County General Hospital as a volunteer, her heart pounded harder than it ever had in the diner. The hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. The pace was fast, purposeful. Lives were being held together in every room. And then she saw Sarah. She was at the nurse's station, hair pulled back, scrubs crisp, moving with the same calm confidence Emma remembered from that morning. For a moment, Emma froze. All the gratitude she'd been carrying suddenly felt too big to hold inside. Sarah looked up and smiled. Emma crossed the room before she could second-guess herself. When she spoke, her voice cracked. "I don't know if you remember me," she said. Sarah stood up instantly. I remember, she replied. I could never forget. They hugged right there in the hallway. No words at first, just the understanding between two people whose lives had intersected at exactly the right moment. Emma felt it then, fully and completely. That what Sarah had given her wasn't just safety. It was possibility. From that day on, Emma volunteered whenever she could. She shadowed nurses. She learned how to take vitals, how to speak gently to patients who were scared, how to stay steady in moments of chaos. And when she struggled, when doubt crept in, Sarah was there, quietly encouraging, never pushing, always believing. One afternoon, after a long shift, Emma finally found the words she'd been holding on to. Sarah gave me my life back, she said. Now I want to give that to others. If Emma's courage to testify inspires you, share this video. Someone in your life needs to see what bravery looks like. And while Emma was building a future she never imagined, Sarah's story was spreading in ways she never expected. The story didn't stay inside that diner for long. Within days, local news stations picked it up. At first, it was framed as a shocking act of courage, an exhausted nurse stopping a crime in progress. But as reporters dug deeper, the story widened. This wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years, and the single moment that finally broke it. Sarah didn't seek the attention. In fact, she avoided it. When reporters called, she redirected them to Emma. When cameras showed up at the hospital, she slipped outside entrances. She insisted she wasn't a hero, just someone who did what needed to be done. But the community saw it differently. To them, she was proof that integrity still mattered, that someone could step in without looking away. The diner owner watched the coverage unfold with a growing sense of shame. Customers began asking hard questions. Former employees spoke up about what they'd seen, what they'd felt pressured to ignore. Within a week, the manager who had hidden in the back that morning was fired. Publicly, without excuses. New safety protocols were put in place immediately. Panic buttons installed behind the counter. Clear policies empowering staff to refuse service and call for help. Security cameras upgraded and monitored in real time. The diner didn't just reopen, it reset its values. But it didn't stop there. Inspired by what had happened, nearby businesses began talking to each other. Waitresses, baristas, delivery drivers, gas station attendants. People who had always worked alone, quietly absorbing mistreatment, started sharing stories. A community watch program formed almost overnight. Not vigilantism, just presence, awareness, communication, people looking out for one another. Service workers reported something they hadn't felt in years. Relief. They walked into their shifts standing a little straighter. They spoke up sooner. They knew they weren't isolated anymore. Fear had lost its monopoly. Then came the trial. Marcus and Tony Delgado entered the courtroom with the same arrogance they'd carried for years. They had always relied on silence to protect them. Intimidation. The belief that no one would ever stand up, let alone testify. They were wrong. One by one, victims took the stand. Some with steady voices. Some through tears. 17 lives unfolded in that room. 17 stories of fear, coercion, lost sleep, and stolen dignity. Each account stripped away another layer of the brothers' control. When the verdict was read, there was no celebration, just a collective exhale. The sentencing came weeks later, and that was when the full weight of accountability finally landed. Before delivering the sentence, the judge began reading impact statements. All 17 of them. He read slowly, carefully, every name, every detail, every consequence. It took 45 minutes. 45 uninterrupted minutes of truth. The courtroom was silent except for the judge's voice. By the time he finished, Marcus's head was in his hands. Tony stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking. For the first time, there was nowhere to hide. No threats left to make. No power left to wield. They were sentenced to 7 to 10 years each. Not just punishment, but recognition. Recognition of harm. Recognition of victims. Recognition that the system, this time, had worked. Outside the courthouse, the mood wasn't celebratory. It was something deeper. Completion. A sense that a long, unfinished chapter had finally been closed. The community continued to change in quiet, meaningful ways. People checked on one another more. Managers listened sooner. Workers trusted that speaking up wouldn't automatically mean retaliation. Justice hadn't just corrected a crime. It had reshaped a culture. And through it all, Sarah remained exactly who she had always been. She went back to her shifts. She cared for patients. She drank her coffee in the same booth at the diner. She refused interviews she didn't think mattered. But one recognition did reach her. The police department invited her to a small ceremony. No speeches, no spotlight, just gratitude. Atlas, the German shepherd who never attacked, who never broke discipline even when danger was inches away, received a commendation for exemplary restraint under pressure. His reward was simple and fitting. A steak dinner. Sarah laughed harder than anyone else that night. Because for her, that moment said everything. This wasn't about domination. It wasn't about violence. It was about control, discipline, and choosing protection over power. The community had changed. The victims had been heard. The bullies had been held accountable. Justice hadn't been loud, but it had been complete. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Because the algorithm buries real heroes, but you can make sure they're seen. 3 months later, the diner looks the same. The coffee still smells rich and familiar. The bell above the door still rings with the same soft chime. The vinyl booths are still worn in all the places where people have sat for years, carrying their routines, their worries, their ordinary lives. Sarah sits in the same booth by the window. It's early, but not rushed. The kind of quiet morning that only exists between night shifts and the rest of the world waking up. She wraps her hands around a mug, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. Her shoulders are relaxed in a way they weren't before. Not because her life is easier, but because something inside her has settled. Atlas lies beneath the table, stretched out comfortably, his breathing slow and even. He doesn't scan the room. He doesn't listen for threats. He sleeps, completely at peace. Emma approaches with the coffee pot, her movements confident now, familiar. She pours without asking. She doesn't need to. Same as always, she says with a smile. Sarah looks up at her, returning it. You remembered. Emma laughs softly. I always remember. There's an ease between them that didn't exist before. Not the intensity of that morning. Not the rawness of fear or adrenaline. Something quieter. Something earned. Emma is back at the diner part-time while she's in school. Not because she has to, but because she wants to. Because this place no longer represents fear. It represents growth. Closure. A starting point rather than a trap. They talk briefly. About classes. About patients Sarah had the night before. About nothing important and everything that matters. The kind of conversation that doesn't need words to carry weight. When Emma walks away, Sarah watches her go. Not with pride exactly, but with something deeper. Recognition. Later, when Sarah reflects on that morning, she's honest about it. I was so tired, she says. I almost didn't stop for breakfast. She remembers sitting in her car, engine idling, debating whether to just go home, whether to sleep, whether to take the long way and skip the diner altogether. I almost minded my own business. She doesn't say it with regret. She says it with understanding. Because she knows how close she came to choosing comfort. How human that instinct was. How easy it would have been to drive away and never know what happened next. But I learned in the Marines, she continues, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. That lesson wasn't learned in one moment. It was built slowly. In training. In combat. In failure. In promises made under impossible circumstances. The promise she made in Fallujah wasn't about heroics. It wasn't about saving everyone. It was about refusing to look away when action was possible. About not letting fear make the decision for her. That morning in the diner, fear was there. She felt it. The exhaustion. The risk. The awareness of how fast things could go wrong. But she acted anyway. And because of that choice, 17 lives shifted course. Emma found her voice. Her mother received treatment. A community reclaimed its sense of safety. Predators lost their power. Silence was broken. Sarah doesn't frame it as destiny or fate. She doesn't romanticize it. She simply understands that moments like that exist for everyone. We all have that moment, the story reminds us. That choice. Between comfort and courage. Between silence and standing up. Most people won't face knife-wielding extortionists in a diner. Most people won't be tested in ways that make the news. But everyone encounters moments where someone is being diminished, threatened, ignored, treated as disposable. Moments where staying silent feels easier. Moments where speaking up feels risky. Moments where doing nothing feels justified. Sarah chose courage, and 17 lives changed because of it. The promise she made long ago was kept. Not once, but again and again. in small decisions, in quiet resolve, in choosing to remain the kind of person who acts when it matters. Every single day. If this story moved you, here's what I need you to do. First, hit that like button if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Second, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about real people who refuse to let injustice win. Bullies and trolls hate when these stories go viral, but that's exactly why they need to. Third, comment below. I stand for justice. Let's create the biggest wave of support this platform has ever seen. Because when good people stay silent, bullies win. But when we speak up, even just in a comment section, we change the culture. And finally, share this video with one person who needs to be reminded that courage is contagious. Just one person. That's all it takes to start a ripple effect. Sarah didn't wake up that morning planning to be a hero. She was exhausted. She just wanted breakfast. But she chose action over apathy. And that choice mattered. What will you choose?